Cold kills quietly. It doesn't announce itself the way a bullet does. It creeps in through wet socks and thin gloves, through gaps in a collar left open for 30 seconds too long, through the ground beneath a man trying to sleep in a foxhole when the temperature has dropped below zero and the wind is moving across open terrain without anything to slow it down. Every soldier who has ever fought in a cold weather environment knows that the enemy wearing a uniform is only half the problem. The other half is the one that has no uniform at all, that fights without mercy and without pause. And that has been killing soldiers since the First Army ever marched into winter. Understanding how American soldiers managed that enemy across more than 2 centuries of warfare is a story about ingenuity, about suffering, about institutional failure and institutional learning, and ultimately about the gap between what a man can endure and what he is actually asked to endure when his country sends him to fight in the cold. The American experience with cold weather combat begins, in many ways, at Valley Forge in the winter of 1777 and 1778. And the picture it presents is almost entirely one of catastrophic failure. The Continental Army encamped there was not defeated by British forces. It was nearly destroyed by cold, hunger, and the complete absence of adequate supplies. Soldiers wrapped rags around their feet because they had no shoes. They slept in huts that were barely more than assembled timber with gaps in the walls, warmed by fires that consumed wood faster than exhausted men could cut it. Frostbite was routine. Death from exposure was common. The miracle of Valley Forge is not that the Army survived the winter in good condition. It is that it survived at all. And the lesson that American military leadership drew from that experience, imperfectly and incompletely, was that keeping soldiers warm was not a luxury, but a prerequisite for having soldiers at all. The basic tools available to soldiers for most of American military history were simple and ancient. Wool was the primary material for cold weather clothing, and for good reason. Wool retains a significant portion of its insulating capacity even when wet, which no other widely available natural fiber could claim. A wool blanket soaked through with rain or snow is still a blanket. Cotton, in the same condition, becomes dead weight, drawing heat away from the body faster than it can be generated. American soldiers from the Revolution through the Civil War and well into the 20th century relied on wool uniforms, wool blankets, and wool overcoats as their primary defense against cold. The quality and quantity of those items varied enormously depending on the war, the theater, the year, and the competence of the supply system trying to deliver them. The Civil War demonstrated in brutal detail what happens when cold weather supply chains break down under the pressure of large-scale operations. Union and Confederate forces both suffered from inadequate cold weather gear in various campaigns, and the suffering was not evenly distributed. A unit that had been stationary long enough to establish a winter camp with proper log huts, fireplaces, and reasonably maintained supply lines could get through a northern winter in reasonable condition. A unit that was on the move, fighting, and dependent on supply wagons that couldn't keep pace with tactical operations faced a different situation entirely. Men improvised with captured equipment, with civilian goods taken from surrounding farms and towns, with anything they could find that would hold heat. They built fires whenever tactical circumstances permitted and huddled around them in numbers that would have made any safety-conscious civilian deeply uncomfortable. The fires were not optional. They were survival. The approach to fire building in the field was one of the primary skills that soldiers across American military history learned quickly and refined through necessity. A fire that produced too much smoke was a tactical liability, advertising a position to anyone within miles. A fire too small to generate real warmth was worse than nothing, consuming precious wood while providing inadequate heat. The ideal field fire in cold weather was small, hot, and well shielded, burning dry wood that produced minimal smoke and positioned to reflect heat toward the men using it, rather than sending it straight upward into the sky. Soldiers learned to dig small pits, to use rocks as reflectors, to build fires in ways that maximized heat output while minimizing visibility. These were not skills taught in any manual. They were learned through cold nights and passed from experienced soldiers to new arrivals in the informal education that armies have always provided alongside their official training. The First World War introduced American soldiers to the specific misery of cold combined with persistent moisture in the trenches of France and Belgium. Trench foot, caused by prolonged exposure to cold and wet conditions rather than freezing temperatures alone, became one of the most significant medical problems of the war. A soldier whose feet were wet for days at a time, which in a waterlogged trench was simply the normal condition, could develop tissue damage so severe that amputation became necessary. The American military's response to this problem involved both medical education and equipment changes, including improved waterproofing for boots and more aggressive protocols for keeping feet dry. But the fundamental problem of fighting in a trench system that collected water, that was exposed to rain and mud and cold with no possibility of proper drainage, was not solvable through equipment alone. It required rotating men out of the front line regularly enough that their feet could dry, which in turn required having enough troops to make rotation possible without compromising defensive capacity. The Second World War brought American soldiers into cold weather environments of a severity that the previous generation's experience had not fully prepared the institution to handle. The Italian campaign fought through the Apennine Mountains in conditions that combined cold, rain, snow, and steep terrain in a combination uniquely hostile to large-scale operations, produced cold weather casualties at rates that alarmed commanders who had expected a relatively quick advance up the peninsula. Mountain warfare in winter is a specific and demanding kind of combat that requires specific and demanding cold weather preparation, and the Army learned this lesson progressively and painfully over months of fighting that extracted a price in frostbite, hypothermia, and exposure injuries that the casualty rolls did not always fully capture. The gear available to American soldiers in World War II was substantially better than what their fathers had carried in the previous war, but it was still imperfect and still subject to the eternal problem of supply chains that couldn't always deliver what soldiers needed when and where they needed it. The Army issued layered clothing systems that, in theory, allowed soldiers to adjust their insulation level to their current level of activity, adding or removing layers as they moved from active combat to static positions and back. In practice, this system worked well when all the layers were actually present. When resupply failed, when packs were lost, when soldiers had been fighting continuously for days without the opportunity to retrieve their cold weather gear, the elegant theory of layering broke down into reality of men in whatever they had, trying to stay warm enough to function. The wool blanket remained a central piece of cold weather survival equipment, supplemented in World War II by the Army's issue sleeping bag, which represented a significant improvement over the simple blanket, but still fell short of what extreme cold environments demanded. Soldiers in the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944, perhaps the most famous cold weather engagement in American military history, experienced temperatures that dropped well below 0 Fahrenheit in conditions that combined the cold with snow, overcast skies that prevented air resupply for critical days, and an enemy offensive that had stripped many units of vehicles, supplies, and the ability to establish the kind of sheltered positions that made surviving extreme cold manageable. Men slept in holes in the frozen ground, wrapped in whatever they had, burning whatever would burn, and the cold casualties that resulted from those conditions were substantial even among units that fought effectively throughout the battle. The specific techniques soldiers used to generate and conserve heat in the field were a combination of institutional knowledge, common sense, and desperate improvisation. Body heat was the primary resource, and managing it meant understanding both how to generate it and how to prevent its loss. Physical activity generated heat, which was useful when moving but created a dangerous dynamic when soldiers stopped. The sweat produced by exertion in cold weather became a heat sink the moment activity ceased, wicking warmth away from the body with the same efficiency that made wet cotton so deadly. Experienced cold weather soldiers learned to regulate their activity level carefully, avoiding sweating when possible, ventilating their clothing during exertion to prevent moisture buildup, and changing into dry layers whenever circumstances permitted. The advice to stay dry was not obvious to soldiers from warm climates encountering winter combat for the first time. It had to be taught, and the teaching often happened after the first painful lesson of what wet clothing did to a man trying to sleep in sub-zero temperatures. Korea brought American soldiers into cold weather conditions that many veterans of World War II's European theaters said were the worst they had ever experienced. The Korean winter, especially in the mountainous terrain of the north where American and Allied forces operated in late 1950, combined temperatures that regularly dropped to 20 and 30 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, with winds that drove those temperatures lower, and a tactical situation that prevented the kind of shelter construction and sustained warming that survival in those conditions ideally required. The Chosin Reservoir Campaign of November and December 1950, in which United States Marine Corps and Army units fought their way out of a Chinese encirclement in temperatures that reached 40 below zero in some locations, became the defining American cold weather combat experience of the post-war era. The gear available to American forces at Chosin was better than anything previous generations had carried, but it was still not equal to the conditions. The primary cold weather boot issued to American forces, the Shu-Pak, was designed for static cold weather conditions rather than the combination of sustained physical activity and extreme cold that characterized the Chosin fighting. It performed adequately when soldiers were moving, generating body heat that kept feet warm inside the boot. When soldiers stopped moving, as they inevitably did in defensive positions and during rest periods, the boot's insulation became insufficient for the temperatures involved. Frostbite rates at Chosin were severe, and the medical after-action analysis of what had caused them drove significant changes in cold weather footwear development that eventually produced much more capable systems for later conflicts. Vietnam presented a different kind of cold weather challenge than the Korean or European theaters. The highlands of Vietnam experienced cold by tropical standards, with temperatures that dropped into the 40s and occasionally lower at higher elevations, combined with rain and humidity that made even moderate cold feel extreme. Soldiers who had been operating in jungle heat for weeks found the highland nights genuinely difficult, and the wet conditions that characterized the entire country made anything resembling real warmth difficult to maintain. The solution in Vietnam was often fire. Small fires built when tactical circumstances allowed, heated meals from sea ration cans warmed over improvised heat sources, the handful of minutes close to something generating heat that made the rest of the cold endurable. Soldiers became expert at producing heat from minimal resources, at identifying every available combustible and using it efficiently, at the entire craft of staying warm in environments that provided nothing to support that goal without significant human effort. The cold weather equipment that American forces carried by the time of operations in Afghanistan represented the culmination of decades of development driven by every painful lesson from Valley Forge forward. Synthetic insulating materials that retained their effectiveness when wet, waterproof breathable outer shells that kept moisture out while allowing the vapor from physical activity to escape. Boot systems designed specifically for the combination of activity level and temperature range expected in a given environment. Sleeping bag systems rated accurately for the temperatures they would actually encounter. All of these represented an enormous advance over the wool blankets and leather boots that had been the primary tools of cold weather survival for most of American military history. The technology was not perfect and was never going to be because the fundamental challenge of keeping a human body warm in extreme cold, while that body is simultaneously expected to perform physically demanding and tactically demanding work, has no perfect solution. But the American soldier of the early 21st century carried cold weather equipment that would have seemed almost miraculous to the men who wrapped rags around their feet at Valley Forge or huddled in frozen foxholes at Bastogne. What connects all of these experiences across all the years and all the theaters is something that no equipment, however good, can fully replace. The knowledge of how to use what you have. The discipline to follow cold weather protocols even when they are inconvenient. And the unit cohesion that transforms cold weather survival from an individual struggle into a collective one. The fire that a squad builds together warms every man in it. The dry socks shared from a pack that one soldier managed to keep dry saved the feet of a man who lost his. The body heat of 10 men sleeping pressed together in a 2-man hole keeps all 10 of them alive. Cold weather survival has always been, at its core, a social endeavor. And the American military has learned this lesson repeatedly through suffering and applied it repeatedly through the small daily acts of soldiers looking after each other when the temperature drops and the wind comes up and the cold begins its quiet, patient work.